Hello, everybody. Welcome to New and Dangerous Opinions, brought to you by the Providence Post, providencepost.com. I'm your host, Derek Peterson. Today is March 8th, the year of our Lord 2026. So, today we're going to talk about another little known event leading up to the Revolutionary War. One of my favorite events called the Gaspee Affair, or the burning of the Gaspee. It happened actually right near where I grew up, right near where I spent a lot of my youth, and in the waters where I spent a lot of my youth. And it was actually the first time there was an armed conflict with British officers and actual somebody got shot. There was actually bloodshot. So it was a very bold move by the Rhode Islanders. We'll get into first. I'll just give a little brief intro, like discussion on what happened, and then we'll do a little geography, take a look at this map, and kind of understand exactly how it all went down, and then we'll get into some of the history of it, the background of it, why it happened, and then the actual incident itself. So, which is a very important event in Rhode Island history, at least. It's weird how nobody really talks about it or knows about it, like the Pine Tree riots. These things were very well known in the colonies at that time and really were the things that led up to the Revolutionary War. And again, Boston Tea Party gets all the credit, Lexington and Concord gets all the credit because all those things took place in Boston where all the journalists were. So, first, a little quick little brief on the whole event. So the Gaspee affair was a significant event in the lead up to the American Revolution. HMS Gaspee was a Royal Navy revenue schooner a schooner, by the way, is just a multi-mast sailboat. Um, was a revenue schooner that enforced the navigation acts around Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island. Navigation acts were obviously a bunch of taxes that were put in by the British government in 1772. It was actually June 9th, 1772. It ran aground in shallow water while chasing the packet boat Hannah on June 9th off Warwick, Rhode Island. A group of men led by Abraham Whipple and John Brown attacked, boarded, and burned the Gaspee to the waterline. The event sharply increased tensions between American colonists and Crown officials, particularly given that it had followed the Boston Massacre of 1770. Crown officials in Rhode Island aimed to increase their control over the colony's legitimate trade and stamp out smuggling in order to increase their revenue from the colony. Rhode Islanders increasingly protested the Townshend Acts and other British policies that had interfered with the colony's traditional businesses, which primarily rested on involvement in the triangular slave trade. I'll get into that in just a second. Along with similar events in Narragansett Bay, the affair marked the first acts of violent uprising against Crown authority in British North America, preceding the Boston Tea Party by more than a year and moving the 13 colonies as a whole toward the coming War for Independence. So, right. So this event took place a couple months after the Pine Tree riots. I did a video on the Pine Tree riots earlier. Regarding the slave trade, Rhode Island, the first law Rhode Island passed in 54, was outlawing slavery. The second law they passed was outlawing slavery. Slavery was always outlawed there. There was no slaves in Rhode Island. There was like 1,000 slaves, they said, people claim, but they were mostly all indentured servants, which just means that came here from England or some other place and basically had to work off their, either 4 years, 3, 4, 7 years debt by working for somebody that paid their passage and got them set up here, helped them set up shop here. That's mainly what it was. The triangular slave trade was molasses, rum, and then slaves from Africa. But people always try to slander Rhode Island by saying it was a slave trade state. It was the only one that made slavery illegal, and they didn't really have any slaves. So anyhow, you got to be careful. You got to read real history books, not get slandered by these modern interpretations of things. So that's what happened. Let's take a look at the map here. So again, the Gaspee was a British ship that was sent to the Narragansett Bay. This is the Narragansett Bay here. Okay, it's part of Rhode Island. Okay, here's Providence. Here's Newport. Right, this is the entrance to the Atlantic, and it's the Atlantic Ocean out here. these are what we used to call the islands. Patience and Prudence is Patience Island. This is Prudence Island. Um, and so what happened was this Gaspee was patrolling these waters looking for smugglers. Okay. Rhode Island was known by the British government as the Rogue Islands, right? Because they were notorious smugglers. Rhode Island had been given its independence in a charter in, like, I think it was 1663 by England, and so they really weren't even supposed to be subjected to any of these things. They were kind of a sovereign colony, sovereign country, really. But um, hey, we'll get into the background on all of this in a little bit. But the bottom line is England was trying to raise money because they'd spent a bunch of money in these wars that they'd been engaged in and needed to raise a bunch of money, so they tried to slam it on us. Not unlike what's happening now. So anyway, this is the Narragansett Bay here. I spent a lot of my life on these waters. Literally years of my life were spent on these waters in this bay, especially this area of the bay. I worked as a professional. I was a fisherman. I dug clams, right? Quahogs, they're called. Quahogs are, it's the proper name. These hard shell clams, you see them probably in grocery stores and things, called little necks. It's a hard shell clam. They're called quahogs, and it's what actually the first money that was ever used in Americas was called wampum, and wampum were these little beads, purple and white beads that were made from quahog shells. That's what the Indians used to use for trade. And then we came here and started making mass producing wampum in factories and hyperinflated the currency. Again, not that different than what we're doing now. So anyway, that's a whole other story. But okay, so just to give a little concept here of distances. So I grew up, or a lot of my youth rather, was spent at least. Well, I lived right here, actually, right about here, and I kept my boat moored right out here. Okay, this is the cove. I used to duck hunt in here. I had blinds set up in here, and this is the cove. One of my little buddies died here when I was a kid, actually under this bridge. He was going out to duck hunt, and he had his chest waders on, and the boat went down and he got sucked to the bottom right underneath this bridge here. It's called the White Bridge. Um, so yeah, I kept my boat moored right here. It's weird how there's no boats moored anymore. They probably passed a law making it illegal to moor boats now. Rhode Island's become so liberal. But anyhow, there used to be quite a few boats out here. We used to water ski around up and down here and weave all the boats. And so I kept my boat moored here, and I would drive out all the way down this Barrington River, all the way out here. So I moored here, and I would cruise out here in my little wooden skiff. It's a very heavy wedge-shaped boat, flat bottom. That's good for digging clams, but it's terrible on the water because every wave comes over your bow and you get soaked. And I did this winter and summer, all year round, basically, for years through high school and college, and even after college a little bit. And so I would motor all the way from here all the way out to the islands usually, or if the bay was open, I would dig in here. And basically, cohogging, you just have a wooden boat and you have a big long rake, and you just sit there on the side of the boat all day digging, and pull up the rake and pull the clams in. Right. So I spent years doing that, so I know all of these waters very, very well. And just to give a concept of distance here, so from where I moored all the way down this river, all the way out here to the islands is about 8 miles. It was kind of slow going because this is all no wake zone in here. But anyhow, I didn't usually pay attention if it was in the morning, especially. And or we dig out here. This event we're talking about today happened over here on the Gaspee Point. Okay, what's now called the Gaspee Point. My grandparents lived right about here. Or right about here, I think. To be official, they lived. Where's Muskeg Beach? There it is. Yeah, they lived right there. So anyhow, what happened was this ship. So it's about 8 miles from here to here. Okay, so you can see it's not a gigantic bay. Okay, so from all the way here to out to here is 8 miles. Probably another 8 to 10 miles, 12 miles out to the Atlantic. So what happened was this Gaspee was patrolling these waters looking for ships that were carrying cargo without paying a tax. So they were smuggling, right? A lot of the smuggling they did was rum, because Providence was actually one of the largest rum producers. Rhode Island was one of the largest rum producers in the world, and but they smuggled all sorts of things. They smuggled, building materials and foods and all sorts of things, and they were avoiding, these people. Like I said, they were called the Rogue Island. It was called Rogue Island by England because they hated paying taxes and they would always resist and fight everything that they tried to do. And so this Gaspee ship was sent here to patrol and to try to hunt down the Gaspee, or to try to hunt down smugglers. And so they were getting chased through these waters. We'll get into this whole outline of the incident in a little bit, but they were getting chased, and the ship Hannah was being chased by this larger ship called the Gaspee that had a whole British crew on it. And they were going up into this, they went up here into this Providence River. Okay. It's called the Providence River. And, these local guys knew the waters really well. And there's a big sandbar here off this point that you can see still there. And so there's a river here that comes in that dumps all this. That's what the current dumps all this sand here. And so they just scooted by over. They were in a smaller boat. It was a falling tide. So that means the tide was going out, right? And they knew that they drew less water. And so they just, scooted around these bars here, sandbars. And the larger ship, the Gaspee, gets stuck here on these sandbars. And then the Rhode Island ship just cruised on up here to Providence, told everybody what happened, and they put together a troop of people, and they all came out and in boats from Providence. Actually, the news spread really fast because people actually came from all the way up in here and actually went by Prudence Island, Prudence and Patience Island, and came up this way also. And they attacked the ship from the front and rear, so the cannons couldn't get a shot at them. And they ended up shooting the captain of the ship in the groin. He lived, and but he was severely wounded. They shot him with a musket ball, just missed his by a couple of inches, and he lived. Though they got a medical treatment, took everyone off the ship, and then burned the ship to the ground. So it was a big event, right, in American history, a gigantic event. And it's a very important event in Rhode Island, actually, because every year they still have a ceremony every year where they do a mock ceremony. Basically, they have a giant, like, 2-day party, and then they have this mock burning of the Gaspee every year, where they take like a model of the Gaspee. It's on floats. It's a metal boat, and they light it on fire and set it free. I still remember as a kid, actually, where when I was a little kid, I used to walk down here from my grandparents' house, which was right there. I'd walk down here and play on this beach here called Muskchuck Beach, and or cut through these woods here through the marsh and get down to the beach. And I still remember finding the burned Gaspee, probably on a June 10th, I suppose, but right here on this point, it was the ground right here, actually. And I remember playing on it even as a little kid. I still remember that. And we called it in. I told my grandfather, he called it in and told him where it was. This was a long time ago, almost half a century ago, probably. And so that's basically what happened. That was the event that happened. And Rhode Island was a very rebellious state. Again, they had been given a charter that granted them basic sovereignty. So it really was outrageous that England was trying to enforce these taxes on them and ride herd over them the way they were. They often confiscated stuff that they found on boats that was smuggling, and actually would steal it and just take it themselves up to Boston, where it would be, I guess, sold off or investigated. So, all right, let's read through the history just to get a little more background on all of this so we can be more technical than just my storytelling from memory. So the background, the British Customs Service had a history of facing strong resistance in the 13 colonies. In the 18th century, Britain was at war during much of this period and was not in a strategic position to risk antagonizing its overseas colonies. Several successive Ministries implemented new policies following Britain's victory in the French and Indian War, the component of the Seven-Year War in North America, in an attempt, all my ancestors fought in that also, in an attempt, or many of my ancestors fought in that also, in an attempt to increase control within the colonies and to recoup some of the heavy cost of the war. The British Parliament argued that revenue was necessary to bolster military and naval defense positions along the borders of their distant colonies, and also to pay the debt which Britain had incurred in pursuing the war against France. One policy included deputizing Royal Navy officers to enforce custom laws in American ports. The Admiralty purchased 6 Marblehead sloops and schooners and gave them anglicized French names based on the recent acquisitions in Canada, removing the French accents. The enforcements became increasingly intrusive and aggressive, and Narragansett Bay Rhode Islanders finally responded by attacking HMS St. John in 1764, and they burned the HMS Liberty in 1768 on Goat Island. So this event wasn't the first of this kind, it was just the most aggressive. And Captain Samuel Hood of HMS Ramsey reporting in 1767 that Gaspee was repaired in Halifax, which is in Nova Scotia, after damaging her gripe and false keel. After going ashore near Rhode Island, suggests Gaspee was no stranger to Rhode Islanders or its shoals. In early 1772, Lieutenant William Dunningston sailed Gaspee into Narragansett Bay to enforce customs collections and mandatory inspection of cargo. He arrived in Rhode Island in February and met with Governor Joseph Wanton soon after he began patrolling Narragansett Bay. Gaspee stopped and inspected the sloop Fortune on February 17th and seized 12 hogsheads, which are barrels, of undeclared rum. Dunningston sent the Fortune and seized rum to Boston, believing that any seized items left in a Rhode Island port would be reclaimed by colonists. They had done it before, and we just stole it back again, or raided them, at night. This move brought outrage within the Rhode Island colony because Dunningston had taken upon himself the authority to determine where the trial should take place concerning the seizure, superseding the authority of Wanton. Furthermore, it was a direct violation of the Rhode Island Royal Charter, which I mentioned earlier, to hold a trial outside of Rhode Island for an arrest that took place within the colony. Dunningston and his crew became increasingly aggressive in the searches, boarding, and seizures, even going so far as to stop merchants who were on shore and force searches of their wares. Public resentment and outrage continued to escalate against Gaspee in particular and against the British in general. A local sheriff threatened Dunningston with arrest, and Rear Admiral John Montague responded with a letter threatening to hang as pirates anyone who made an effort to rescue ships taken by Dunningston during his operations. On March 21st, Rhode Island Deputy Governor Darius Sessions wrote to Wanton requesting that the basis of Dunningston's authority be examined. Sessions included the opinion of Chief Justice Stephen Hopkins, who argues that no commander of any vessel has a right to use any authority in the body of the colony without previously applying to the governor and showing his warrant for so doing. Wanton wrote to Dunningston the next day demanding, "Produce me your commission and instructions, if you have any, which was your duty to have done when you first came within the jurisdiction of this colony." Dunningston returned a rude reply to Wanton, refusing to leave his ship or to acknowledge Wanton's elected authority within Rhode Island. So the actual incident, I kind of gave you the background of what happened or showed it to you on the map there. But so on June 9th, Gaspee gave chase to packet ship Hannah, but ran aground in shallow water on the northwestern side of the bay of what is now Gaspee Point. The crew were unable to free the ship, and Dunningston decided to wait for high tide to set the vessel afloat before that could happen. However, a band of Providence men in 18 boats, armed with pistols and guns and clubs, led by Abraham Whipple and John Brown, decided to act on the opportunity offered of putting an end to the trouble and vexation she daily caused. In an affidavit, one of the men testifies they were intent on burning the schooner. John Brown's brother Joseph was also in the boarding party. Their flotilla rowed out to the ship, which was about 9 miles from Rhode Island, and boarded it at 1 a.m. in the morning. June 9th, the crew put up feeble resistance, in which they were attacked with handspikes, and Dunningston was shot and wounded in the groin. Dunningston requested to be allowed down to his cabin, and 2 surgeons were ordered to dress his wounds. The boarding party casually read through the ship's papers before forcing the crew off the ship and setting it aflame. Since Gaspee was burnt and did not explode, it is likely that her magazine gunpowder had been looted. So they stole the gunpowder and everything else that was on board, and they set it aflame and burned it down to the waterline. A few days after being forced off the ship, Dunningston was arrested for an earlier seizure of colonial cargo. His commanding officer, Rear Admiral Montague, freed him by paying his fine and then promptly sent him back to England to face a court martial on the incident, since there were not enough ships from which to form a court martial at Boston. So, a couple interesting points about this. It's that, a tide, from just so in case those who don't know, a tide is only 6 hours, right? So, from a dead low tide to a dead high tide is about 6 hours. The tide changes in that part of the river, I think, are probably like 5 foot, 4 foot, 5 foot on a regular moon. And so, you don't have a lot of time to put together this party, right? There was a falling tide. So they probably had, say it was 2 hours from dead low. So they probably had like, 6 hours or so to be able to put this party together and get out there. So they mobilized pretty quick. Rumor has it that they had a little party ahead of time, and then headed out there in these 18 different boats. There was an exchange. All the crew was asleep on the boat actually when they arrived, and there was one guy standing guard, and he yelled to them, and he told them not to come on board, and they called them names and cussed them out, called him a tyrant and a rascal. And then the captain came on board, came out on the deck in his nightgown, basically, in his nightwear, with a pistol and a sword, and they had an exchange of words. And then one of the men on one of the ships actually shot him and hit him in the groin. Dunningston said, "I'm done for," meaning he thought he was dead. He ended up living. Like I said, they let him treat his wounds and then took him down. The ball stayed in his groin. Um, After even they took him back to England, it was still in there, and apparently years later, it actually came out through gravity, I guess, went down, came out his knee, or they removed it from down around his knee area. So, but he lived. But that was the first person shot, really, in this time period leading up to the Revolutionary War. And it's again, it's amazing that no one really talks about it. It's an amazing event that happened. And trying to think if there's anything else I missed here. Um, I guess that pretty much covers it. Just again, back to the map. The so this chase probably only lasted, again, these aren't motorboats, these are sailboats. So, it was probably they were probably out here in the Bay Area, I would think, maybe out by the islands. And so you're only talking about 8 miles or so, not even, probably like 6 miles chase that took place. And then it's probably another 6 or 8 miles to get up to Providence after that, or 5 or 6 miles to get up to Providence. So that's basically the story of the burning of the Gaspee. Again, it's a very important event in American history that I hope people remember, because it was really that spirit of these colonists, especially the Rhode Islanders. Again, Rogue Island is what it was called, because they really rebelled against all the laws that were being implemented on them. Again, because they did have a charter. They were unique of all the 13 colonies because they had a charter granting them sovereignty, and England was still trying to enforce these laws. So that's basically it. That is the Gaspee affair. Hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. I'm Derek Peterson for Providence Post. Bye-bye.